I'm Susan Cheka-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. And we welcome you to Books Sandwiched In. We've had a wonderful lineup this season, and of course, we've been delighted to have everyone back here for this in-person program. We ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers and artists who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year. A bit of housekeeping. Next week is our last BSI review for the spring. Please register if you plan to attend or let us know if you need assistance registering. We'll continue to limit capacity and have socially distanced seating. We keep an attendance list each week, so you do not need to print or bring your tickets, and masking is not required at the library at this time, although it is strongly recommended. We have had a bit of a delay in posting the videos of BSI this season, but we do hope to have all the reviews available with closed captioning in May. If you are having difficulty hearing at any time during the program, please just raise your hand and we'll adjust the volume. And to access the induction loop in the auditorium, we ask that you set your hearing aid to the T switch. Thank you for helping to make it possible for us to present in-person events while keeping everyone safe during the ongoing pandemic. Today's review is of Putting It Together, How Stephen Sondheim and I Created Sunday in the Park with George by James Lapine. The book offers a behind-the-scenes look at the 2-year process of making the beloved Pulitzer Prize-winning Broadway musical Sunday in the Park with George, which was inspired by George Seurat's 19th century painting, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. Since we always try to share information on relevant library resources at these events, I wanted to remind everyone that the Arts and Literature Division offers hundreds of framed and canvas prints that you can borrow with your library card. The collection spans everything from modern pieces by local artists to classics, including this framed version of Seurat's painting, which was the inspiration for the play, and the book, which we'll hear about today. Each piece of artwork can be borrowed from the library for 8 weeks at a time, and you can borrow up to 4 pieces of artwork at any given time. The Rochester Public Library also has a few thousand musical scores available for loan with your library card. Central's collection is the most extensive, and includes the score for Sunday in the Park with George, and we have a copy on the stage that you can take a look at if you're interested. As the slogan so accurately states, the library continues to offer more than you think. Our reviewer today is Geva Theater Artistic Director Mark Cuddy, and I ask you to please join me in welcoming him to our podium.
Thank you, Susan. I just want to do this. I really don't need to, but... Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I love that it's always love the 12-12, you know, easy to remember. And yes, I'm here to review this handsome book. Can I have a show of hands who has gotten the book, who has read this book? A couple, great. I just don't know how much I can lie about it this afternoon. This is fascinating, and I love. Thank you so much for having this because, I'll be referring to the painting several times, and it really helps for all of you to be looking at it. It's central to the act of creation of Sunday in the Park with George, the musical. It's also one of those paintings that you can just stare at and lose yourself in. Not only by the style of painting, the all the little dots, all the little pointillism, but by the number of people in it, the characters that are in this painting. James Lapine started writing Sunday in the Park with George in 1982. It was his first Broadway show. And 35 years later, in 2017, he decided to revisit that process. He had seen a revival of Sunday in the Park with George and started thinking about what it was like to put this musical together. So he interviewed 40 people who had worked on the show in some capacity. And he writes that he wanted to add his contemporary commentary from today's perspective, not try to remember what was in his head necessarily 35 years ago. And he encouraged the interviewees to be very frank, which they were. So, full disclosure, before we begin, I don't think Sunday in the Park with George is a very good musical. I think, like all of Sondheim's musicals, every single one of them, there are brilliant, genius parts, genius songs, incredible thought behind so much of what Sondheim writes and composes. I think there are only three, I bet there are some Sondheim fans here, and for me there are only three complete musicals that he's written. Sweeney Todd, A Little Night Music, and Company. Even though Company's a little bit dated, there's a fantastic revival right now on Broadway that's been rethought, where Bobby, the lead character, is played by a woman. But those three feel like there's a beginning, middle, and end. The others, again, have brilliance. And I think as we look at how this musical was made, as Lapine explains, we can kind of understand a little bit of why it may be problematic. Sunday in the Park with George always seemed very precious to me. It's a musical about, obviously, art and making art. And, you know, in my role as an artistic director, I have to do season planning, of course. I choose with my artistic team, but it's my ultimate responsibility, all of the shows. And we read a number of plays, especially, not as opposed to musicals, that deal with the art world or artists or painters. And every once in a while we'll do one. Red, about Rothko, was a fantastic play. But I think it's an easy out. I think it's an easy metaphor. I think theater people like to do things about making art because we're making art too. So I have this is all full disclosure. I won't say it outside of this room, but I think it may be a little too neat. However, I am here to review this book, not the musical, and I thoroughly enjoyed putting it together. Despite its overused title, there's a lot of putting it together as themes. So here are a few of my thoughts and reactions to the book. James Lapine states that this is part memoir, part oral history, and part how a musical gets written and produced. Now, I love theatrical memoirs. I love their theatrical diaries, and I love theatrical autobiographies. Theatrical biographies are okay, but there's nothing like coming from the artist, his or herself. I love to get inside the artist's head. Here are some of my favorite memoirs or autobiographies. The Peter Hall Diaries, from when he was a director of the National Theatre in London. Jack Be Nimble by the director Jack O'Brien. The quintessential one, perhaps the first one that started this genre, written by Moss Hart, called Act One. It's fantastic. You should all get that out from the library. Dropped Names by Frank Langella. Betty Comden's book, Offstage. It's okay. It's great anecdotes, not well written, but very funny. The Year of the King by Anthony Sher. It's about playing Richard III for the RSC in England 1 year on tour. Fascinating. And I just finished Brian Cox's memoir, Putting the Rabbit in the Hat, as opposed to pulling it up. How does it actually get in there? Brian Cox is a Scottish actor, lots of classical work in England, and the star plays the patriarch in Succession, which is fantastic. So I wanted to read about him. And I also love theater books that are written about how they did it and what happened. Why was it a disaster? Because you learn from your failures, right? So such books as Second Act Trouble, which is about musicals and many don't work because of their second act. Hello, Sunday in the Park with George. Making It Big, about the making of the musical Big. Razzle Dazzle by Brighton's own New York Post columnist Michael Rydell, who's written many books. He's not a columnist anymore. He's retired from that. And then one I read a long time ago as an artistic director was very important to me. It was called Minneapolis Rehearsals. Like, what? Well, one of the first big regional theaters in America is the Tyrone Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And this is about the first season, and it was written by an actor involved in all the rehearsals and observing how that company got put together. Now, James Lapine started not as a director, not as a writer. He wrote the book and directed Sunday in the Park with George, which is unusual for his first Broadway show. But he started in graphic design and photography. That's the sort of the world he thought he was going to go into. He calls himself an accidental director. He got asked to direct these very avant-garde, experimental plays in New York City in the downtown. Downtown is like the Lower East Side, these small theaters, and they're very avant-garde. And that's how he started to learn what a director did. And one of the plays that he directed, he used various paintings in it, and one of them was this. So he had some familiarity with Seurat and the painting. This painting fascinated him, as it does so many people. Eventually, a mutual friend set up a first meeting between the neophyte Lapine and the musical god, Stephen Sondheim. It was on June 12th, 1982. That's when they met in Sondheim's apartment. And it was ostensibly to see if they could work together. They wanted to work together. Sondheim was looking for another partner, someone new, as a collaborator, and a mutual friend put them together. Lapine brought a series of visuals. Remember, graphic design, photography. So he brought a bunch of copies of various things, photographs and paintings, and he kind of spread them out on the coffee table, and Sondheim started looking through and started staring at a copy of this one, and they started having a conversation about the painting. Now, Seurat painted this in 1884, well, from 1884 to 1886. It took him 2 years. So Lapine started talking about Seurat and this painting, and as they stared at it, they realized that of all these characters, and they started talking about who they might be, and they realized there was a character missing, the painter. So they started talking about, well, how could Seurat approach this, and what was it like to create this? 2 years it took him to paint this. Now, Sondheim admitted that, he says, quote, "I'm very ill-read. I don't read very much." This is Stephen Sondheim. So, very much to him might be something different than to you and me. But he was intrigued by the visuals. He really loved that idea that he could get inspired by something else. So they agreed that James Lapine would go off and start writing the libretto, the book of a musical about Sunday in the Park with George, and they came up with that clever title. And then several months later, he would bring what he had written back to Sondheim. So he brought back a draft of Act One, and Sondheim read it a couple of times, and he became worried that it was a play that held together, and it wasn't a musical. And the reason is Sondheim says it's not a waste of time to write a bad song. It's a waste of time to write a wrong song, a song that's wrong for the show. So Sondheim kept checking in with Lapine as he began maybe doodling with lyrics for each of the characters. Sondheim has a great understanding about what a character needs and where that song might show up in a musical. And he asked Lapine to write monologues for each of the main characters, because I need to understand who these characters are in order for me to write a song for them. Now, the idea of the music coming out of story as opposed to added on to story didn't start with Sondheim. Sondheim's mentor, of course, was Oscar Hammerstein. Oscar and his family lived above the Sondheims in the same apartment building. So he grew up going to Hammerstein's apartment. Yeah, nice to have Oscar Hammerstein upstairs as your mentor. But that idea of writing something that's really based in character and based in story. Months later, they went to the Art Institute of Chicago in December of '82, and the staff there showed them x-rays of this painting. It's where the painting lives. And so they could see all the layers that Seurat had painted over 2 years. And that, again, inspired them in terms of a metaphor of, peeling away layers and building and how to start somewhere, but it's not complete, of course, until you finish the hat, as an example. Apparently, Seurat was very obsessive. Really? I can't imagine. And very reclusive. However, for the mothers in the audience, he had dinner with his mother every single night. How's that for a good son? I know. Well, I'm sure she paid. Sondheim began responding to Lapine's writing in, as he says, a different way than a number of other collaborators. He was starting to respond to the way Lapine was writing in sort of rhythms and the use of language that Lapine was using. So he started to steal like a phrase or one sentence that he could build a song from, an idea. He really was attracted to Lapine's writing. So he began composing. Sondheim says, often a line of dialogue will pop out, and I think, that's got to be the core of a song. So the lyrics always come first for him. I sometimes ask my collaborator to write a monologue so I know what's inside, and he would then start making lists. Sometimes there's great notes in this book. There are photographs of the yellow pads that Sondheim uses, and he just starts making lists of words, lists of metaphors, and then he starts shaping them into quatrains and finding rhythms among words, and he goes on and on and on. You all know, if you know Sondheim, that he's brilliant, and he's just a great, he loves puzzles. I mean, he's a fanatic about puzzles, and especially word puzzles. He loves all of that. He loves the figuring of that stuff out. So he makes lists and lists, and before he actually writing lyrics. And then he starts, so he starts with words and phrases, then rhymes, are rhyming words, and then rhythms, like how do we put together, what's the rhythm of the song, Then he gets to the lyrics, then he gets to the music. When he gets to the music, and he's thinking of an entire show, he says that he tries to establish early on some motifs. Obvious ones are melodic motifs, but he says he's very fond of chordic motifs, of chords, because they play on an audience's subconscious. They don't really realize they're there. And then he keeps coming back to them. Like they create a bed, a foundation for the musical arc in a show. He also says he tries to figure out, when he's writing a song, he tries to figure out with the lyric for that song what the last line is going to be so that he can work towards it. I guess if you're a writer, it's like, I want to write the ending and then figure out how to get there, right? So that's one of the tricks and he says that he learned that from Oscar Hammerstein. So they started to put together this material of a first act, and Playwrights Horizons, which is a fantastic off-Broadway theater company, nonprofit, and did a lot of new plays, and had done one of James Lapine's plays, not musicals, because this was the first musical he's working on. He went to Playwrights Horizons and said, will you help us develop this musical? Andre Bishop, the then artistic director, who then became the artistic director at Lincoln Center Theater, said, sure. Lapine asked for a 7-week workshop. This is back in 1982-83. The idea of workshops for musicals it wasn't done. I mean, the commercial producers would never pay for something like that. You'd write it, you'd have some reason, and then you'd go out of town, right? The commercial producers who were producing on Broadway would do the workshop in front of an audience where you could make money out of town in various cities, New Haven and Philadelphia and Boston, etc. So the idea of a non-for-profit theater committing 7 weeks, 3 weeks of rehearsals, 1 week of full technical rehearsals on stage, sets, lights, costumes, for a workshop, and 3 weeks of performances, which, weren't Broadway, they're just like a small ticket price in this off-Broadway theater, was sort of unheard of. But they did it. And Andre Bishop says he raised money the old-fashioned way, like from the producers. He raised money for the workshop from wealthy widows. I love that. It's like, yes. So he went and said, hey, it's Sondheim. The name Sondheim could raise money. And the idea that Stephen Sondheim was working on something that was going to be in this little off-Broadway theater was also kind of extraordinary. They had to start casting this, and they offered, of course, the roles to two leads, Bernadette Peters and Mandy Patinkin. Now, I'm sure there are many discussions about who should play these roles, but Sondheim had been writing those two roles, Georges and Dot. Georges, he was writing for a bass baritone. Mandy Patinkin is a tenor. And Dot, he was writing for a soprano, and Bernadette is very much a mezzo soprano. So but he wanted those people. He agreed on those people, so he had to, redo all of what he had written for them. And then they filled the rest of the cast with Broadway veterans who, again, weren't used to this workshop idea. They also weren't used to James Lapine's off, downtown experimental methods. They did a lot of improvisation. They did a lot of talking. They did, and these Broadway veterans are like, show me the music. Let me learn the music. Tell me where you want me to go. And so they were very uncomfortable. Many of the actors were very uncomfortable. They were also uncomfortable because the characters really weren't fully developed. They only had a skeleton of Act 1 and no Act 2 when they went into rehearsals. They had a book of Act 1 and some songs, but clearly it wasn't complete, and how could they develop their work? So One of the people in that workshop was Christine Baranski, the great actress. She had a very interesting insight. She goes, American actors want to process creating a character from the inside out. They want to get into the psychology. They want to find the emotion. They want to have the backstory. They want to know the subtext. English actors will just take direction from the director, like, I need you to be, angrily stomp across the room, for example. And they have to figure out how to do that, how to make it part of their character. So they work from the outside in. Give me what you want me to do, and I'll figure out the reason for doing it, as opposed to the other way for American actors. Although some of the actors in that first company had worked downtown. One of them played the boatman, William Perry, who's in the book, quoted many times. And Bill was in one of our productions, our second version of Convenience. They went into rehearsal, and there's a great quote that Stephen Sondheim talks about Jerome Robbins, the great director, choreographer. He said, Jerry Robbins would insist on no visitors while they are creating staging, even collaborators. The composer couldn't enter the rehearsal room, let alone producers or other guests, because the work at that moment was so personal and so fragile. He'd bar everybody from those early rehearsals where you are, especially something new, you're creating something new, and with the actors, it's very fragile. I totally understand that. They had their first workshop performance on July 6th, 1983, and they had, like, most of Act 1, but not all the songs. That was ready, and it just ran for 3 weeks. In the final 3 performances, apparently, they shared a little bit of Act 2. So Sondheim was off writing, but was very, very slow. He says he never puts forward unfinished or draft version songs. Sondheim wants to get them perfect before putting them into rehearsal. That's just the way he worked. As opposed to others would be like, yeah, I write a song overnight, and you put it up and you hear it, and you hear the actor perform, like, okay, no, I'll go work on that, and had to be perfect for Sondheim. It was frustrating. It was intense. They were still rehearsing in the daytime, putting in new material while they were doing these performances of these workshops in the evening for paying audiences. At one point, Mandy Patinkin just flipped out. And during a daytime rehearsal, he ran out of the theater to quit. Lapine ran after him and caught him on the sidewalk, and he convinced him to do that night's performance, given that Mandy's wife and agent were coming to see the performance that night. And Lapine said, look, Mandy, do tonight, let them see it, and if they agree with you that you should walk away from this, fine, we'll cast somebody else. And of course, they saw it, and they went, oh my God, this is incredible. You have to stay in this, Mandy. And, he was glad he did. The great song in Act 1, Finishing the Hat, didn't come until the 3rd week of workshop performances. And, sometimes there's a song, this was one of them, that pulls an entire act together. And yet those actors were out there trying to sell an act that was incomplete every night. It got enough interest that commercial producers started to become attached to it. So again, this was done by a nonprofit theater, but of course the Schuberts and other commercial producers were there to see it. They decided to option it, the Schuberts, and they asked Manny Eisenberg to be the lead producer, to actually like the line producer, the hands-on producer for them. Now, Manny Eisenberg at that point had done, as a producer or general manager, over 65 different Broadway musicals. He did all of the Neil Simon plays on Broadway, Manny. And one of Manny's daughters lives here in Rochester. And I met Manny up here and down in New York. And he's still going. Really great guy. Here's a fun fact. Things usually take time, to write a musical. Lots of variables. There's music. There are lyrics. There are a book. There are stars. There's scenery. They're telling a story visually. However, Gypsy, that great musical Gypsy, from the first day of writing to opening on Broadway, only took 6 months. That just blows my mind. They must have rehearsed, written for 3 months or 4 months, put it into rehearsal, made some changes, went into previews, and opened. Crazy. Sweeney Todd only took 6 to 8 months to write. It was very clear what he wanted to write. And Sweeney Todd, if you know it, it's kind of gory, but I always use it as an example of subject matter doesn't matter if it's good. It's, oh yes, it'll be a revenge musical, and people, Mrs. Lovett will bake the murdered victims into pies, meat pies, and sell them. Like, what? That's a musical? Yes, it's brilliant. So I always use that example. Don't worry about the content. If it's really good, it'll work. There are many comments during the preview periods about maybe they should just expand the first act, not do the second act, because the second act, in their concept, traveled from 1886 to present day and was all the descendants of Surratt and of Dot and others. And audiences, frankly, never really warmed to that idea. There's like, oh, really? Can't you just, we love those characters in the first act. Why'd you get rid of them and just have their descendants? It was hard. One of the people who were added to this project, of course, was Sondheim's agent, who became very instrumental getting it onto Broadway. Her name was Flora Roberts, really quintessential New York agent. She tells a story about representing another client, and the Schuberts, the powerful Schuberts lawyer, called her to do a contract for her client. And the lawyer started with, well, this is what we're going to do. And she stopped him and said, I'm an agent. I don't take dictation. It's a negotiation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. One of the things explained in the book is the difference between an orchestrator and an arranger and a musical director. Those are 3 different jobs. And a copyist, of course, when you're doing something new, who actually literally copies the notes onto a score and is super expensive in New York. An orchestrator deals directly with putting the notes from the piano score. Sondheim would compose on a piano. So putting those onto instruments. So oh, this sounds like a trombone, this is an oboe, this is a violin, and that's what an orchestrator does. Makes an orchestra out of a piano score. An arranger actually moves the melodies around and puts in harmonies, and if you're a dance arranger, you create the dance numbers. The great composers didn't write their own dance breaks. They had a dance arranger who would take the motifs and the melodies and create the dynamic for a dance break. So interesting. They had great designs, as I said, in the workshop. The costumes had painted fabric, very expensive, but no dots. There weren't dots on it. They did a first preview April the 2nd, 1984. And the first act was running 1 hour and 40 minutes. Many people walked out during the first act. If they didn't work out in the first act, they walked out after the first act. The Schuberts, trying to make some money, of course, sold a lot of theater parties, group sales where they'd have a dinner and drinks and then come to the theater, and they wanted singing and dancing. They didn't want intellectual art making. They just hated it. Manny Eisenberg said, well, of that preview audience, those workshop audiences, 25% thought it was terrific, 50% thought it was terrible, and 25% were just baffled. They had no idea what it was. Richard Maltby, who's a lyricist and a director and a book writer, he compiled and put together Ain't Misbehavin'. He put together Ring of Fire that we did outdoors last summer, among others. He has a quote. He says, "Previewing a new musical in New York City is like having a gynecological exam in Times Square." Speaking of Ring of Fire, apparently Johnny Cash came to one of the workshop performances and sat in the front row. And the entire cast, I mean, it's Johnny Cash. So the entire cast backstage, like, it's Johnny Cash, it's Johnny Cash, it's Johnny Cash. Is he going to stay for the second act? And he did, like a good man. So that was a real win. The final two songs of the first act didn't go in. Oh, I'm sorry. I've moved on. I've just jumped ahead. Right. Well, that's on Broadway. But the final two songs didn't go into the show until the day before the press came to the Broadway production, and they completed the arc. You know, there's a lot written about how it had a lot of material, but it wasn't all just like tied together. And the final two songs he wrote are in the second act, called Children and Art and Lesson Number 8. And one explains the whole musical, and one explains George, his inner feelings. And they were the last two songs to go in. And once they went in, these quotes from the actors like, "Oh my God, thank you. Like, now I feel complete. I feel like there's a beginning, middle, and end." They finally opened on May the 2nd, 1984 on Broadway, and James Lapine said, "Well, as a joke, I used to send opening night cards to actors saying, 'Don't be nervous, your entire career depends on tonight.'" I love that. Because he stopped doing that. They had a great opening night, except they got poor reviews from some of the dailies, the Post, the Daily News. However, Frank Rich, who was at that time the theater critic of the New York Times, gave it a very good review. Wasn't quite a rave, but he followed it up. He came again right after it opened and then wrote a big article in the Times that praised it, and it took off from there. It really kept the show open. The show ran for 18 months. Which is modest, not, in terms of recouping money. It cost to open it $2.1 million back then, which is about $5 million now. But Lapine says that would cost $13 million really now with the costs going up. You couldn't do it that same way that we did it, and it would be that much expensive. A year later, it won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama, one of only a handful of musicals that have won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. So, I'm here for the book, and I'm here also, you're here really because you love Sondheim, I know. And there's really intimate quotes from Sondheim. I was trying to write some of them down, and I included some of them to you. But it's that inner working and understanding how collaborators work. Some of you in your lives have had to work closely with others to create something. It doesn't have to be a musical. But you understand what that sort of give and take is, and how long it takes to just establish some vocabulary, establish the way you communicate, knowing who likes to work alone, when you want to be alone, when you need to be with someone, who's going to work and bring the work forward first, who needs to be nagged, and it's a really fascinating look at that collaboration. It also has wonderful, frank quotes from many of the actors and designers and et cetera for this 35 years ago, and for me, was really fulfilling. And I really appreciate getting a free copy from the Friends of the Library. So I'll take some questions that you might have about, oh, thank you.